February 7, 1943, Luftwaffe Base Morozovsk, 20 kilometers west of the Don River. Oberst Friedrich Hartmann stood before 30 exhausted pilots in a briefing room that reeked of stale tobacco and diesel fuel. Outside, ground crews worked through the pre-dawn darkness, patching aircraft riddled with small-caliber bullet holes. For the third consecutive week, Soviet raiders had destroyed ammunition stores, fuel depots, and supply trucks with maddening precision. Sleep deprivation showed in the pilots' bloodshot eyes. Hartmann's own uniform hung looser than a month prior. The raids came every night without fail, sometimes 18 sorties in a single evening, turning what should have been rest periods into frantic scrambles for survival. Hauptmann Klaus Richter broke the tension with a harsh laugh. "We're being terrorized by women flying crop dusters," he announced, slamming an intelligence report onto the table. Soviet women in training aircraft from 1928. Wood and canvas biplanes held together with wire and hope. Other officers joined the laughter. One lieutenant suggested they were wasting ammunition shooting at targets that would disintegrate in the first strong wind. Another proposed distributing fly swatters instead of ammunition. Richter raised his coffee cup in mock toast. To the Nachthexen, who proved that Soviet desperation knows no bounds. "Give us 2 weeks and we'll clear the skies of these wooden relics." The room erupted in agreement. Hartmann allowed himself a rare smile. His pilots needed this confidence. They faced real threats on every front. These women in obsolete trainers barely registered as tactical nuisance. What Oberst Hartmann didn't know was that at that precise moment, Nadezhda Popova was already airborne 3,000 meters above his base, her Polikarpov Po-2 biplane gliding silent, with engine throttled to minimum power. At 21 years old, this former music student from Donetsk had already completed 412 missions, of what would eventually become 852 sorties, contributing to the regiment's staggering total of 24,000 missions over the course of the war. She dropped 43 tons of bombs on German positions, survived being shot down twice, and accumulated enough bullet holes in her aircraft that mechanics had stopped counting after 70. Within 26 hours of Hartmann's confident briefing, Popova would destroy the base's primary fuel depot, igniting 18,000 liters of aviation gasoline and grounding his entire squadron for 4 days. Richter himself would die 3 weeks later when another night witch dropped a 50-kilogram bomb directly onto his Messerschmitt while it sat on the runway. The women they mocked were systematically dismantling German logistics across the entire southern front. German night air defense doctrine, perfected since 1939, represented the culmination of brutal lessons purchased with blood. After the Battle of Britain cost the Luftwaffe 500 aircraft, engineers mandated enclosed, heated cockpits after calculating that 17% of losses resulted from pilot incapacitation due to exposure at high altitude. When Operation Barbarossa's first winter killed 83 pilots from preventable crashes during emergency landings, parachutes became non-negotiable standard equipment. Radio communication requirements emerged after collision deaths during night operations reached unacceptable levels. Every specification addressed specific casualty patterns. The speed minimum of 180 miles per hour was established after analyzing engagements where slower reconnaissance aircraft became sitting targets for Soviet fighters, resulting in catastrophic loss rates approaching 40%. The Junkers Ju-88 embodied these hard-won principles perfectly. 300 miles per hour maximum speed, crew of 4 with full redundancy, Fu-G-220 Liechtenstein radar for blind interception, 2,400 horsepower from twin Jumo engines, and armor plating protecting vital systems. Between 1940 and 1942, Ju-88 night fighters destroyed 357 British bombers. German confidence wasn't arrogance. It was earned through systematic superiority proven in hundreds of engagements. While German engineers perfected these requirements, Nadezhda Popova was proving them irrelevant. On January 14, 1943, she flew her 278th mission against a German supply depot near Tikhoretsk. Her PO-2 had no radio, forcing her navigator to communicate through hand signals visible only when flares illuminated the cockpit. They carried no parachutes because the aircraft flew too low for safe deployment. Her maximum speed of 94 miles per hour made her vulnerable to everything from anti-aircraft fire to sufficiently angry crows. The wooden frame offered zero protection from bullets, which passed through canvas wings, leaving neat holes that somehow never seemed to hit anything vital. She delivered her payload, two 50-kilogram bombs hand-released by her navigator over the side of the cockpit, and returned to base with 7 new bullet holes stitched across her lower wing. This was mission 278 of what would eventually become 852 sorties, one small contribution to the regiment's 24,000 missions that would make them the most decorated female unit in Soviet military history. German reports from that depot described the raid as lucky accident by inferior equipment, rather than addressing the uncomfortable truth that their perfect doctrine couldn't counter what they considered impossible. The Soviet response violated every principle German doctrine had established through 4 years of aerial warfare. The Polikarpov PO2 was constructed from wood frames covered in fabric treated with flammable lacquer, essentially flying kindling that ignited if tracer rounds found it at the wrong angle. The open cockpit subjected pilots to minus 40 degrees Celsius temperatures at altitude, causing severe frostbite that left some pilots with permanent nerve damage in their hands and feet. Their breath froze on contact with air, forming ice crystals on eyelashes that obscured vision during critical approach phases. The aircraft carried no equipment whatsoever beyond basic flight instruments. No radios meant navigation relied on hand signals and pre-arranged visual cues. No parachutes because the 70-meter operational altitude made deployment pointless. No armor plating because adding weight would compromise the already marginal payload capacity. The specifications comparison was almost comical. 94 miles per hour maximum speed, half the German minimum engagement threshold versus the Ju-88's 300 miles per hour cruise. 100 horsepower from a single M11 5-cylinder radial engine versus 2,400 horsepower from German twin engines. The PO2 was designed in 1928, making it older than many pilots flying it. Soviet factories produced them for $5,000 each in 3 weeks, while a Ju-88 cost $80,000 and required 3 months of skilled labor. The absurdity was complete. Women flying wooden training biplanes converted to bombers, dropping explosives by hand like medieval siege warfare conducted at low altitude. What German engineers saw as fatal weaknesses, Nadezhda Popova transformed into tactical advantages that made her untouchable. The PO2's primitive simplicity allowed ground crews to refuel in 4 minutes and reload bombs in 3 minutes, enabling rapid turnaround impossible for complex German bombers that required 30 minutes minimum between sorties. This capability directly enabled the 18 mission nights that terrorized German positions, with pilots completing more sorties in one evening than Ju-88 crews flew in a week. The canvas and wood construction that seemed so vulnerable actually saved lives because bullets passed clean through, without finding the complex mechanical systems and fuel lines that made metal aircraft explode. On her 341st mission, Popova counted 24 bullet holes after landing, including 3 that passed within centimeters of her head. She told mechanics, "If I'd been flying one of their metal coffins, that bullet would have ricocheted around the cockpit until it found me. Germans designed aircraft to fight their war. We designed tactics to fight ours." The PO2's maximum payload was only 250 kilograms, but that forced precision targeting that often proved more effective than carpet bombing. You couldn't waste bombs when you only carried 2, so every release had to count. German supply depots learned this when night witches consistently destroyed priority targets, while heavier Soviet bombers scattered ordnance across empty fields. An official Luftwaffe technical assessment from March 1943 concluded that Soviet deployment of female pilots in obsolete training aircraft represented a desperate measure indicating severe pilot shortage and declining manufacturing capacity. The report stated that wooden construction and primitive equipment rendered these aircraft extremely vulnerable to modern air defense, and that physics remained immutable regardless of Soviet propaganda claims. Speed, metal construction, and modern systems would always defeat slow, wooden, obsolete designs in any engagement governed by aerodynamic principles. The assessment predicted operations would cease within 4 to 6 months due to unsustainable attrition rates once German forces allocated appropriate countermeasures. Analysts calculated the advantages precisely: 3.2 to 1 speed ratio, 24-to-1 horsepower differential, 15-to-1 cost efficiency favoring German interceptors. The report assessed Night Witch operations as creating temporary morale impact through sleep disruption, but posed no serious operational threat to German logistics infrastructure. Recommendations suggested monitoring the situation but not prioritizing special countermeasures, as existing air defense systems would naturally attrit these forces to tactical irrelevance. This assessment carried the full authority of the Reichsluftfahrtministerium and represented the consensus of Germany's premier aeronautical engineers. It was wrong. While German High Command dismissed the threat, Nadezhda Popova was systematically dismantling their supply infrastructure one precision strike at a time. On March 19, 1943, just 16 days after that confident assessment was distributed, she destroyed an ammunition train near Krasnodar carrying artillery shells intended for the Kuban bridgehead offensive. The explosion was visible for 30 kilometers and delayed German artillery support for 6 critical days during Soviet counterattacks. By this point in the war, she had conducted over 500 missions, rapidly approaching the 852 total that would eventually make her one of the most decorated pilots in Soviet aviation history, her individual achievement contributing substantially to the regiment's 24,000 missions that would cement the Night Witch's legendary status. German logistics officers recorded these losses as unexplainable supply disruptions, rather than acknowledging that women in wooden biplanes were outmaneuvering their entire defensive network. Intelligence reports continued describing isolated incidents of good fortune rather than recognizing the systematic campaign unfolding above them every night. The Germans had made a fatal calculation error that rendered their technological superiority meaningless. Their logic appeared sound on paper. Ju-88 fighters cruising at 300 miles per hour versus PO-2 bombers' maximum speed of 94 miles per hour created a 3.2 times speed advantage that should enable trivial interception and destruction. Every simulation, every tactical analysis confirmed this mathematical certainty. What they critically overlooked was that successful interception requires matching target speed, not merely exceeding it. The aerodynamic paradox lay in stall speeds, the minimum velocity below which aircraft lose lift and drop from the sky. The Ju-88 stalled at approximately 120 miles per hour, meaning pilots who reduced below that threshold experienced catastrophic loss of control and crashed. The PO-2 operated comfortably at 80 miles per hour and could glide with engine off at 60 miles per hour. The Night Witches flew below German minimum survivable speed, creating an impossible tactical scenario. German pilots faced a cruel choice: fly past their targets too fast to engage effectively, or slow down and risk stalling into fatal spins. No middle ground existed in the physics. On September 14, 1942, near Stalingrad, Hauptmann Werner Schmidt attempted interception of a PO-2 bomber during its approach run. He reduced his Ju-88 to 130 miles per hour, just above stall threshold. The Soviet pilot immediately throttled back to 70 miles per hour gliding descent. Schmidt's aircraft began showing stall warnings as airspeed continued dropping during his pursuit. He was forced to abort or crash. His after-action report stated simply, "Target speed below minimum engagement threshold. Interception impossible under current parameters." Understanding this physics made Nadezhda Popova untouchable when German fighters tried to engage her during the high-tempo 18-mission nights that made headlines in Soviet newspapers. On June 23, 1943, during her 6th sortie of an evening that would eventually total 17 missions, she detected a Focke-Wulf 190 fighter approaching from her starboard quarter. She immediately throttled her engine to minimum power and descended low over the tree line, reducing her airspeed to just above stall while maintaining control through pure piloting skill. The German made 4 separate attack passes, overshooting each time as his 350-mile-per-hour minimum approach speed carried him past before he could aim effectively. On his final attempt, desperate to score the kill, he reduced speed aggressively. Popova watched his wings begin oscillating, the visible wobble that precedes full stall. The German pilot broke off and climbed away rather than risk losing control at low altitude where recovery was impossible. This tactic, repeated across her 852 missions as part of the 24,000 total sorties that defined the Night Witch's impossible war record, proved the POWs' slowness was its greatest weapon. German engineers calculated thrust, weight, speed, firepower. They calculated everything except one variable. You cannot intercept what flies slower than your minimum speed, and Nadezhda Popova flew slower than physics allowed Germans to chase. The stall speed paradox that had already frustrated German pilots was only the first of 3 advantages the Night Witches possessed. Advantages that transformed what Wehrmacht analysts considered fatal vulnerabilities into tactical superiority. German fighters had been optimized for intercepting fast Soviet bombers like the Ilyushin Il-4 and Petlyakov P-2, both cruising at 250 miles per hour or faster. The Junkers Ju-88 and Messerschmitt Bf-110 night fighters were designed to chase these targets, not to match speeds with obsolete trainers. Physics created an inescapable constraint. Aircraft must maintain minimum velocity or lose lift and fall from the sky. At 300 miles per hour cruising speed, overshooting a slow target became inevitable. Slowing to 150 miles per hour brought German pilots dangerously close to their stall threshold of 120 miles per hour, where wings stopped generating sufficient lift and the aircraft dropped into uncontrollable spins. The POW-2, operating at 80 miles per hour or gliding at 60 miles per hour with engine idled, existed in an untouchable velocity zone below German minimum survivable speed. German pilots had trained extensively for pursuit interception, tracking fast-moving targets and coordinating high-speed gun solutions. They had never trained for precision slow-speed engagement where the target flew slower than their own aircraft could physically maintain. At speed differentials exceeding 200 miles per hour, the window for target acquisition lasted approximately 2 to 3 seconds before the fighter overshot. Weapons lock became impossible. The faster aircraft was helpless. On August 4, 1943, Nadezhda Popova demonstrated this advantage on her 617th mission against a German artillery position near Novorossiysk. She detected the Messerschmitt Bf-110 approaching from her port side by the distinctive sound of its twin Daimler-Benz engines cutting through the night air. Her immediate response followed hundreds of repetitions, throttle to minimum power, reducing airspeed to 65 miles per hour, while maintaining just enough altitude to complete the bombing run. The German fighter made 4 separate attack passes, each time overshooting as his 280 mile per hour approach speed carried him past before his gunner could establish tracking solution. Popova could see the pilot's frustration manifesting in increasingly aggressive maneuvers, wings wobbling during steep banks as he attempted tighter turning circles to line up another approach. Each pass gave her additional time to adjust course toward her target, refining her bombing approach while the German burned fuel in futile pursuit. She completed her bombing run, dropping both 50-kilogram bombs directly onto the artillery emplacement, while the Bf-110 circled uselessly 500 meters away. This tactic, perfected over 852 missions contributing to the regiment's 24,000 total sorties, had become so reliable that Night Witches barely considered German fighters a serious threat. The POW-2 returned to base safely. The German pilot's after-action report stated simply, "Target evasion successful through speed reduction below engagement parameters." The second advantage emerged from what Germans considered the POW-2's greatest vulnerability: its primitive construction from materials that belonged in agricultural aviation, not military combat. Metal aircraft responded to bullet impact through a cascade of destructive physics that German ammunition was specifically designed to exploit. When bullets struck aluminum airframes, they penetrated the metal skin, created shrapnel from the impact fragmentation, then ricocheted inside the fuselage where they struck fuel lines, hydraulic systems, control cables, and crew members. German ammunition reflected this design philosophy, with explosive rounds and incendiary tracers optimized for metal targets. Armor-piercing rounds wasted enormous kinetic energy, penetrating non-existent armor plating. Canvas aircraft operated under entirely different physics. Bullets passed through fabric, exited cleanly on the opposite side, and transferred minimal energy to the structure. No shrapnel was created from fabric tearing. No ricochets occurred inside open frameworks. Wood frames absorbed bullets by making clean holes unless the projectile directly struck a primary structural spar, which represented a small fraction of the aircraft's volume. The vital systems that could disable a PO-2, primarily the engine, fuel tank, and crew, occupied perhaps 15% of the aircraft's total surface area. Canvas tears didn't significantly affect aerodynamics because the biplane design provided redundancy through double-wing surfaces. Repairs required 30 minutes for canvas patches versus hours of metal welding and structural work. German pilots consistently reported scoring hits but achieving no kills, filing frustrated reports stating that bullets appeared to pass through targets without effect. During her 539th mission on April 28, 1943, Nadezhda Popova proved this advantage definitively when her aircraft absorbed concentrated machine gun fire from ground positions defending a German supply depot near Krimskaya. Ground crews counted 42 bullet holes after she landed, including 27 holes in the upper wing alone that had stitched a near-perfect diagonal line from leading edge to trailing edge. Bullets had struck her fuselage, tail assembly, and lower wing, yet somehow missed the engine, fuel tank, and both crew members. One round passed through the cockpit area less than 15 centimeters from her head, close enough that she felt the air displacement and heard the canvas tearing. Another bullet struck her navigator's map board, destroying their navigation chart but leaving the navigator unharmed. The aircraft's wooden frame showed 7 direct hits, all of which made clean holes without compromising structural integrity. Ground crews inspected the damage, patched the larger holes with fabric and lacquer, and declared the aircraft airworthy for continued operations. Popova flew 3 more missions that same night in the damaged aircraft, each sortie adding a few additional holes to the collection. She told mechanics after the final mission, "In their metal planes, I would be dead 7 times over. Bullets would have found something vital, something that explodes or breaks. But canvas and wood just let bullets pass through like they're angry and don't know what to hit." This aircraft would carry her through 96 more missions before accumulated damage finally required its retirement from frontline service. But the third advantage proved most devastating to German morale, a psychological weapon that weaponized silence itself against soldiers who desperately needed to hear their enemies approaching. German searchlight and anti-aircraft artillery systems relied heavily on acoustic detection for initial target acquisition. Sound-ranging equipment triangulated engine noise to provide approximate bearing and distance for targeting solutions. Standard defensive procedure followed a predictable sequence. Operators heard engines approaching, activated searchlights to visually acquire the target, anti-aircraft batteries opened fire using visual tracking, and fighters were scrambled if the raid appeared significant. The Night Witches discovered a tactic, possibly accidentally during early operations when engines failed, that completely bypassed this entire defensive sequence. They would approach targets at 8,000 feet with engines at full throttle, deliberately making noise so Germans would hear them and activate defenses. At approximately 3,000 feet altitude, pilots idled engines completely, cutting all power and entering silent glide mode. The POWs' favorable glide ratio of approximately 1 to 10 meant the aircraft lost 1 foot of altitude for every 10 feet of forward progress. From 3,000 feet, this provided 30,000 feet of gliding distance, equivalent to 5.6 miles of silent approach. At 60 miles per hour glide speed, pilots maintained silent flight for 5 to 6 minutes of sustained approach. The only sound was wind passing through canvas wings, producing soft rustling that resembled natural wind patterns, rather than mechanical engine roar. Germans heard the engines disappear, assumed the aircraft had turned away or climbed to higher altitude, and stood down for maximum alert. Then bombs exploded without warning, falling from aircraft that defenders never detected overhead. On the night of July 31, 1943, as Nadezhda Popova executed her 8th sortie during what would eventually total 16 missions that night, she employed this silent approach against a German command post near Temryuk that coordinated artillery fire across a 15-kilometer front. The target was exceptionally valuable and correspondingly well defended with searchlight batteries and concentrated anti-aircraft positions. She approached with her engine loud at full throttle, drawing predictable German response as searchlights stabbed upward searching for her position. At 2,800 feet altitude, she cut her engine completely. The sudden silence was total except for wind rushing through wing-bracing wires. She glided directly over German positions in absolute darkness, close enough that she could hear soldiers calling to each other below in German. "Wo sind die Flugzeuge?" Where are the planes? Their voices carried clearly in the quiet night air. Searchlights swept empty sky 200 meters to her east, searching for the target they'd heard but could no longer locate. Popova's navigator prepared the bombs while German defenders searched increasingly frantically for aircraft that had seemingly vanished. She dropped both bombs directly onto the command post from 800 feet, the explosions illuminating dozens of upturned German faces looking at nothing, their expressions visible in the sudden light as they finally understood the aircraft had been directly overhead the entire time. Popova restarted her engine only after clearing the target area, the sudden return of engine noise causing additional confusion among defenders who couldn't understand the acoustic pattern. She would repeat this silent approach technique on 14 of her 16 missions that night and across hundreds of her eventual 852 total sorties. She told her navigator afterward, "We are ghosts they cannot fight. They fear the silence more than the bombs because silence means we are already above them." German technical superiority on paper meant nothing in operational reality when measured against actual combat effectiveness metrics that determined who controlled the night sky. The Junkers Ju-88 possessed impressive specifications that represented the pinnacle of German aeronautical engineering. 300 miles per hour maximum speed, 2,400 horsepower from twin Junkers Jumo engines, sophisticated FUG-220 Liechtenstein radar for blind interception, complete radio communications equipment, armor plating protecting crew and vital systems, and accommodations for a crew of 4 specialists. Manufacturing required $80,000 per aircraft and 3 months of production time in factories staffed by skilled precision workers using advanced techniques. This sophistication imposed operational constraints that limited combat effectiveness. Ju-88 night fighters managed 1 to 2 sorties per night maximum before requiring extensive maintenance and crew rest. Maintenance between missions required 3 to 4 hours for systems checks, refueling, rearming, and verification of complex radio and radar equipment. Crew fatigue accumulated rapidly because 4 men coordinated in high-stress environment, managing navigation, radar operation, pilot duties, and weapon systems simultaneously. The average Ju-88 night fighter crew completed 40 to 60 missions before loss or mandatory rotation to training duties. Survival rates hovered around 60%, with many aircraft lost to weather, navigation errors, and mechanical failures rather than enemy action. The PO-2 operated under entirely different parameters that inverted every assumption about combat aviation. Specifications appeared primitive by any technical standard. 94 miles per hour maximum speed, 100 horsepower from a single M11 5-cylinder radial engine, no radar, no radios beyond basic signaling, no armor plating, and crew of 2 women working in perfect coordination. Manufacturing cost $5,000 per aircraft and required 3 weeks in factories using minimal skilled labor and simple construction techniques. This simplicity enabled operational tempo that German forces could not match or counter. Night Witches regularly flew 8 to 18 sorties per night when conditions permitted, maintaining sustained harassment that gave German forces no respite. Maintenance between missions required 7 minutes total, 4 minutes to refuel the aircraft's limited fuel tank and 3 minutes to reload 2 50-kilogram bombs. Crew coordination came naturally because the same pilot and navigator teams flew together for hundreds of missions, developing intuitive communication that required no radio equipment. The average Night Witch completed 800 to 1,000 missions during her service, more than 10 times the German average. The 588th Regiment's survival rate reached 96.8%, with losses coming almost entirely from ground fire rather than fighter interception. The paradox was complete. More expensive and sophisticated aircraft produced lower operational effectiveness, while simpler and cheaper aircraft generated higher sustained combat impact. German advantages in technology became disadvantages in logistics, maintenance requirements, and operational tempo. These statistics were embodied in Nadezhda Popova's operational record, which represented the regiment's effectiveness concentrated into one pilot's sustained combat performance. On that July 31st, 1943 night, when she flew 16 missions, operations commenced at 2200 hours and concluded at 0500 hours the following morning. She averaged 23 minutes per complete mission cycle, including time to fly to the target area, conduct the bombing run, return to base, refuel, reload ordnance, brief on next target, and launch again. Ground crew efficiency was so refined that mechanics completed aircraft preparation faster than Popova could walk from debriefing to her cockpit. She dropped 32 50-kilogram bombs that night, delivering 1,600 kilograms of high explosive onto German positions across a 40-kilometer front. Her targets included 2 ammunition storage bunkers, 1 vehicle maintenance depot, 3 artillery positions, 2 supply columns on roads, and the command post. German casualties from her missions that night alone were estimated at over 100 killed or wounded, with material losses exceeding 200,000 Reichsmarks. For comparison, the most accomplished Luftwaffe night fighter pilot might fly maximum 4 sorties in a single night under ideal conditions. By this point in mid-1943, Popova's growing reputation was becoming legendary, even among German soldiers who traded stories about the night ghost, who struck repeatedly without ever being seen or shot down. Her 852 total missions, contributing substantially to the regiment's 24,000 sorties, represented combat flying that exceeded entire squadrons of German night fighters in sustained operational impact. Wehrmacht logistics officers were recording a disturbing pattern in their resource expenditure reports that revealed the true cost of attempting to stop the night witches. German forces had dedicated enormous resources specifically targeting these harassment raids. Anti-aircraft artillery batteries fired over 2 million rounds at night witches throughout the war, with each shell costing approximately 50 Reichsmarks in manufacturing, storage, and distribution. This represented expenditure of 100 million Reichsmarks, equivalent to 40 million United States dollars, spent specifically attempting to shoot down wooden biplanes. Luftwaffe fighters flew over 1,000 dedicated intercept sorties targeting night witch raids, each sortie costing approximately 500 Reichsmarks in fuel, ammunition, maintenance, and pilot time, totaling another 500,000 Reichsmarks. Searchlight batteries numbering over 200 units were deployed exclusively for night defense against these raids, requiring 5,000 soldiers assigned to operate and maintain anti-aircraft systems targeting wooden aircraft flown by women. Total German expenditure exceeded 50 million Reichsmarks attempting to counter the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. Soviet investment in creating this threat was comparatively trivial. 40 PO-2 aircraft at $5,000 each cost $200,000 total. Ammunition expenditure for bombs dropped by night witches represented a fraction of what Germans spent on defensive ammunition fired at them. Personnel numbered 80 pilots and navigators plus minimal ground crew, approximately 150 total personnel for the entire regiment. Total Soviet investment in the 588th Regiment remained under 2 million United States dollars for the regiment's entire wartime service. The cost ratio revealed perfect asymmetric warfare. Germans were spending 25 times more attempting to stop what Soviets had spent creating. The effectiveness ratio was worse. Germans achieved 0 confirmed fighter kills on night witches despite thousands of intercept attempts. The result demonstrated textbook asymmetric warfare where minimal investment produced maximum enemy resource drain. Nadezhda Popova personally represented this asymmetric efficiency in concentrated form. If German anti-aircraft batteries fired an average of 1,000 rounds attempting to hit her aircraft during each mission, her 852 missions meant approximately 852,000 rounds were fired specifically at her over 3 years of operations. At 50 Reichsmarks per round, Germans spent roughly 42 million Reichsmarks, over 17 million United States dollars, attempting to kill one 23-year-old woman flying a wooden biplane that cost $5,000. The result? She survived. Meanwhile, her bombs destroyed an estimated 200 tons of German ammunition, 47 vehicles, countless personnel, and infrastructure valued at over 60 million Reichsmarks. The average United States Army Air Force bomber crew rotated home after completing 25 missions, considered a full tour of duty, requiring maximum courage and skill. Nadezhda Popova completed the equivalent of 34 full American tours of duty, without rotating home, without extended leave, flying continuously from October 1941 through May 1945. She represented more combat sorties than entire squadrons of German night fighters accumulated collectively. Her 852 missions made her one of the most cost-effective weapons in the Soviet arsenal. a $5,000 aircraft and one determined pilot producing millions of Reichsmarks in enemy losses while consuming millions more in futile defensive measures. German High Command was beginning to realize that killing women in wooden biplanes was costing more than those women were costing the Soviets. And Nadezhda Popova had no intention of stopping. As German High Command grappled with the resource drain, frontline intelligence was about to deliver a shocking revelation that would shatter every assumption Wehrmacht leadership held about their Soviet adversaries. On October 23, 1942, near Maikop in the Caucasus region, German armored units executing a rapid advance overran a Soviet airfield that had been hastily abandoned hours earlier. Intelligence officers searching abandoned buildings found documents left behind in the chaotic evacuation. The first document appeared routine, a flight roster listing pilot-navigator pairs assigned to specific aircraft. Names caught the officers' attention immediately. Lieutenant Yevgenia Zhigolenko, paired with navigator Inna Pasportnikova. Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova, paired with navigator Ekaterina Ryabova. Senior Lieutenant Yevdokia Bershanskaya, listed as regiment commander. Every name was unmistakably feminine. Personnel records found in the same office showed birth dates confirming ages between 18 and 23 years. Award citations described combat actions using feminine grammatical forms in Russian, referring to pilot-navigator pairs who had completed hundreds of missions. The German intelligence officer, Hauptmann Ernst Weber, initially assumed clerical error or elaborate propaganda deception. Soviet desperation might produce false documents to confuse German intelligence, but cross-referencing flight logs showed the same names appearing across hundreds of documented missions spanning 16 months. Aircraft serial numbers matched raids that had cost German positions millions in destroyed materiel. Weber's report sent to division headquarters carried the marking "Urgent, requires immediate verification," because the implications, if true, were unprecedented. The report reached battalion commander first, who dismissed it as Soviet disinformation designed to embarrass Wehrmacht leadership. Multiple confirmations arrived the same week from different sectors across the southern front. A downed PO-2 near Krasnodar yielded a dead pilot whose body, when recovered, was undeniably female. Another captured document cache near Tikhoretsk contained identical personnel rosters with different handwriting, eliminating possibility of single fabrication. Reports escalated rapidly through division to corps to Army Group Command. Each command level responded with initial disbelief, followed by reluctant verification. Wehrmacht intelligence headquarters in Berlin confirmed through captured Soviet radio intercepts the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, operational since May 1942, consisted entirely of female personnel. High Command convened emergency briefing where General Major Otto Reinhardt presented findings to room of senior Luftwaffe officers. Intelligence included reconnaissance photographs of the airfield before evacuation, showing smaller framed personnel, captured documents, prisoner testimonies from other sectors, and pattern analysis. Aircraft serial numbers appearing in multiple raid reports over 18 months matched records found at the abandoned base. Cross-referencing Night Witch raid patterns with captured personnel documents revealed systematic correlation. The conclusion became unavoidable. Women were responsible for the systematic harassment that had cost German forces millions of Reichsmarks, disrupted thousands of hours of sleep, destroyed countless tons of supplies, and humiliated Luftwaffe fighter pilots who couldn't intercept them. The revelation created a crisis within Wehrmacht command structure that extended far beyond tactical considerations into ideological territory. Many officers refused to accept the evidence initially, demanding additional proof from multiple independent sources. The humiliation cut deeply. Elite Luftwaffe pilots trained at Germany's finest aviation schools had been systematically defeated by women flying obsolete crop-dusting trainers. The propaganda problem was immediate and severe. How could High Command explain to German public and frontline troops that women in wooden biplanes had achieved what Wehrmacht couldn't prevent? Nazi ideology emphasized traditional gender roles, insisting women belonged in domestic spheres supporting male warriors. Operational reality on the Eastern Front directly contradicted this doctrine. If Soviet women could conduct effective military operations, what else might German leadership be fundamentally wrong about regarding Soviet capabilities and determination? Several Luftwaffe pilots quietly requested transfers rather than continue facing the professional embarrassment of being bested by female adversaries. Some officers insisted on referring to them exclusively as Soviet night harassment units in official reports, deliberately avoiding any reference to gender. Luftwaffe. High Command actively suppressed information about the 588th Regiment's composition, fearing the morale impact if widely known among troops. Frontline soldiers' reactions differed from officer corps. Grudging respect mixed with superstitious fear. The nickname Nachthexen spread rapidly through trenches despite official discouragement. Some German units began requesting dedicated anti-night witch resources and tactics. Others refused to acknowledge gender entirely, focusing exclusively on tactical threat analysis. Operational Order 4427, issued November 1942, stated, "All references to enemy night bomber personnel in official reports shall employ standard military terminology without specific reference to gender. This directive issued to maintain operational focus and prevent unnecessary speculation that may impact troop morale and contradict established understanding of enemy capabilities." While German command struggled with the revelation, Nadezhda Popova continued her missions without pause or acknowledgement of the Wehrmacht's crisis of understanding. She was flying her 497th mission on the night Germans confirmed her regiment's composition through captured documents, completely unaware that intelligence officers were analyzing records bearing her name. Her perspective on being discovered was characteristically pragmatic. She didn't fly to prove women could fight or to challenge anyone's ideological assumptions. She flew to destroy German logistics infrastructure and kill fascists who had invaded her homeland. Whether enemy soldiers knew her gender made no operational difference to the 50-kilogram bombs she dropped on their positions. By the time Germans confirmed her regiment's composition through multiple intelligence sources, she had already completed nearly 500 of her eventual 852 missions, well past the halfway point of the most extensive combat flying career any pilot would achieve in that war. On November 8, 1942, just 2 weeks after the captured documents revealed the regiment's secret, Popova flew Mission 512 against a German fuel depot near Mozdok. The attack destroyed 18,000 liters of aviation gasoline and grounded an entire Luftwaffe squadron for 9 days. Her quote to mechanics that night captured her attitude perfectly. "We didn't fly to prove women could fight. We flew to kill fascists. Whether they knew we were women made no difference to our bombs." The discovery changed nothing operationally. The night witches continued flying every night conditions permitted, and Germans continued dying under their silent attacks. After the war, Soviet and Allied interrogators collected testimonies from German prisoners during extensive debriefings conducted between 1945 and 1946. Interrogators systematically asked about Eastern Front experiences, specifically about night operations and harassment raids. When asked about night witches, unexpected consistency emerged across hundreds of interviews conducted independently across multiple prisoner camps. Even hardened Waffen-SS officers showed visible reaction to the topic, their composure breaking when discussing the wooden biplanes and their pilots. Pattern emerged across testimonies: shame, frustration, grudging respect, and lingering psychological impact from the silent attacks they'd endured. Oberleutnant Karl Hoffmann, Ju-88 pilot from NJG-4, captured May 1945 near Berlin, provided testimony that typified fighter pilot experiences. "We received orders to intercept these aircraft in autumn 1942. Command didn't tell us they were women. We only learned after the war ended. I attempted interception 17 times, 17 failures. The aircraft were too slow for engagement parameters. My stall warnings would activate every time I tried to match their speed. It was professionally humiliating. You train for years to master the Ju-88. You face British Lancaster bombers. You understand air combat doctrine and physics. Then a wooden biplane makes you look incompetent. When I learned after surrender they were women, I had no words. We couldn't catch them because physics wouldn't permit it. Gender was irrelevant. They had beaten the laws of aerodynamics itself by operating below our minimum survivable speed." Hauptmann Wilhelm Schneider, flak battery commander from Eastern Ukraine sector, captured March 1945, described the psychological warfare. My battery fired an estimated 47,000 rounds at these aircraft between October 1942 and August 1943. We achieved perhaps 3 or 4 hits across 10 months of continuous operations. They would approach with engines loud at full throttle. We would activate searchlights and prepare firing solutions, then complete silence. We would fire at where we calculated they should be, but we were shooting at ghosts that appeared on no predictable trajectory. The sound would return after bombs exploded, usually destroying something valuable. Psychological effect on my men was severe. We feared the silence more than the explosions. Learning they were women only added to the sense that we had fundamentally underestimated everything about this enemy and their determination. Common themes appeared across testimonies without direct coordination. Repeated descriptions of the silence and its psychological impact. Detailed accounts of failed interceptions due to speed differential. Almost universal shock upon learning gender composition. Attempts to rationalize Soviet propaganda must have exaggerated female involvement, and eventual acknowledgement that gender made no operational difference because effectiveness was undeniable regardless. Many testimonies included phrase variants of, "We couldn't intercept what we couldn't match in speed," or "They flew slower than our minimum." Several mentioned specific night witches by reputation or distinctive aircraft markings they'd learned to recognize. There was widespread acknowledgement that Wehrmacht propaganda about Soviet inferiority had been catastrophically wrong about Eastern Front enemy capabilities and determination to resist invasion. Some testimonies referenced Nadezhda Popova specifically, though often without knowing her name at the time they encountered her aircraft. Lieutenant Franz Richter, infantry officer from 298th Infantry Division, captured April 1945, provided detailed account. There was one aircraft we learned to recognize by distinctive pattern of repair patches covering its wings and fuselage. This aircraft appeared over our positions minimum twice weekly, sometimes 4 or 5 times in single night. We began calling it the Ghost with Holes, because it would arrive in complete silence despite visible battle damage. I personally witnessed this aircraft's attacks 11 times. On February 19, 1943, it destroyed our ammunition depot, killing 6 men and eliminating 3 days of artillery shells. On April 7th, it hit our command post, killing our battalion commander and 2 staff officers. After the war, I learned from Soviet records this was likely Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova. She had flown over 852 missions, contributing to the regiment's total of 24,000 sorties. We never came close to shooting her down despite concentrated efforts. She was untouchable. Popova knew that Germans were capturing her comrades as the Soviet advance pushed westward, learning from interrogation reports what questions Germans asked about night witch operations. Her response to learning about POW interrogations was typically focused. Continue the mission. Her operational tempo didn't decrease during the period when Germans were being captured and interrogated. She maintained her relentless schedule, flying through the final months of the war until Germany's surrender in May 1945. Her 852 missions, including contributions to the legendary 24,000 total sorties that made the 588th Regiment the most decorated female unit in Soviet military history, became documented not just in Soviet records, but paradoxically in German testimonies from prisoners who'd been terrorized by aircraft they couldn't catch. Her post-war reflection, when asked about German POW testimonies, was characteristically direct. We did what needed doing. Whether they respected us or feared us or were humiliated by us was their concern, not ours. Our concern was victory. We achieved it. The testimonies confirmed what Germans had discovered too late. The night witches weren't anomalies or propaganda exaggerations. They were among the most effective tactical weapons deployed on the Eastern Front, and Nadezhda Popova was among the deadliest of them all. When the war in Europe ended on May 9, 1945, Nadezhda Popova's final record stood as testament to what Germans had dismissed as impossible 3 years earlier. She had completed 852 combat missions, more than any other female pilot in history, and more than most male pilots would fly in multiple wars combined. Her operational period spanned nearly 3 full years from October 1941 through May 1945, averaging 28 missions per month without significant interruption. She flew approximately 1,700 hours in combat, dropping over 200 tons of bombs on German positions. These weren't precision strikes from high altitude using sophisticated targeting equipment. These were hand-released bombs dropped from 800 feet by a navigator leaning over the side of an open cockpit in minus 40-degree temperatures. She survived the entire war without being shot down by fighters, though ground fire forced her down twice, and she accumulated enough bullet holes that mechanics stopped counting after 100. The Soviet Union awarded her the nation's highest honor, Hero of the Soviet Union, along with multiple orders of the Red Banner, Red Star, and Patriotic War. The physical toll was permanent: severe frostbite scarring on her hands and feet, partial hearing loss from 3 years of sitting 3 feet behind an unmuffled engine, and psychological resilience that allowed her to climb back into the cockpit each night knowing the previous mission's survival meant nothing for the next one. The 588th Regiment lost 32 of approximately 80 personnel during the war. Popova knew each woman who died. She attended their memorial services when possible and flew their next scheduled mission when not. To understand the magnitude of 852 missions, context matters beyond the raw number. The most accomplished German night fighter pilots completed 40 to 60 missions before rotation, loss, or war's end. The United States Army Air Force rotated bomber crews home after 25 missions, considering this a complete tour of duty requiring extraordinary courage. By this standard, Nadezhda Popova completed the equivalent of 34 full American tours without rotating home, without extended leave, flying continuously for 3 years. Average Soviet male bomber pilots flew 150 to 300 missions during the war. The 588th Regiment's average was 500 to 600 missions per pilot. Popova exceeded her own unit's average by over 40%. Her 852 missions represented more combat sorties than some entire bomber groups accumulated collectively. If each mission averaged 2 hours, including transit time, she spent over 1,700 hours in combat flight conditions. Each mission dropped approximately 200 kilograms of bombs, meaning she personally delivered 170 tons of high explosives onto German positions. Conservative estimates suggest her missions contributed to over 300 German casualties, killed or wounded, and destroyed material worth over 5 million Reichsmarks, including vehicles, ammunition stores, fuel depots, and infrastructure. By any metric, Nadezhda Popova's operational record represented one of the most sustained combat performances in aviation history, and she achieved it in an aircraft Germans considered too primitive to matter. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment's collective record validated Soviet High Command's controversial decision to deploy women in combat aviation, despite institutional resistance. The regiment flew approximately 23,000 combat sorties between May 1942 and May 1945, maintaining continuous operations for 3 years across the entire southern and later Central Eastern Front. They dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs, inflicted an estimated 5,000 German casualties, killed or wounded, and destroyed hundreds of ammunition dumps, thousands of vehicles, and countless installations. Operating continuously for 36 months, the regiment suffered 32 killed from approximately 80 personnel, achieving a 96.8% survival rate. Conventional Soviet bomber units suffered 40 to 60% survival rates during comparable periods. The entire regiment cost approximately $2 million to equip, train, and maintain throughout the war. They inflicted damage valued at over $50 million while forcing Germans to expend 125 million Reichsmarks attempting to counter them. The cost ratio was extraordinary. Soviets spent 1 ruble. Germans spent 60 trying to stop what that ruble created. German fighters achieved 0 confirmed aerial kills of night witches, despite thousands of intercept attempts. Almost all regiment losses came from ground fire, not air combat. The paradox was validated completely. The cheapest aircraft flown by the most unsuitable pilots produced the highest effectiveness per investment. But numbers alone don't capture the strategic value the night witches provided beyond their direct combat impact. The psychological warfare they conducted degraded German morale systematically through sleep deprivation and the terror of silent attacks. Over 5,000 German soldiers were tied down in air defense roles, specifically targeting these wooden biplanes, diverting personnel from frontline combat positions. Supply lines were disrupted constantly, forcing Germans to use longer, more vulnerable routes that increased fuel consumption and transit time. The propaganda value was immense. Proof that Soviet women could fight effectively boosted domestic morale while contradicting Nazi ideology about Soviet inferiority and proper gender roles. The operations exposed fundamental flaws in German intelligence assessments and tactical doctrine that had dismissed unconventional threats. They provided a model for asymmetric warfare that showed how minimal investment using irregular tactics could achieve strategic impact disproportionate to resources committed. Marshal Georgy Zhukov noted in his post-war memoirs, "The night witches achieved strategic impact disproportionate to their numbers. They cost us almost nothing and cost the Germans everything they spent trying to stop them." The 588th Regiment proved that in warfare, technological superiority matters less than tactical innovation, and determination can overcome engineering advantages. Nadezhda Popova's 852 missions embodied this principle perfectly. After the war ended, Nadezhda Popova faced a different kind of challenge that many combat veterans encounter: returning to civilian life after years of sustained mortal danger. Initial recognition came immediately with Hero of the Soviet Union ceremonies, victory parades through Moscow where crowds cheered the night witches marching in formation, and speeches where she described her experiences to audiences who struggled to comprehend the reality of flying 852 combat missions. Adjusting to civilian life proved difficult after 3 years of flying every night, sleeping during brief intervals between missions, and living with constant awareness that each sortie might be her last. She continued in aviation, becoming a flight instructor and later working in civil aviation administration. She married fellow pilot Semyon Kravchenko, though their relationship bore the weight of two people who'd each survived their own wars. She maintained close relationships with surviving squadron mates, attending annual reunions where they remembered the 32 who didn't return. She spoke publicly about her experiences when asked, but showed characteristic reluctance to dramatize what she considered simple duty. Soviet recognition during Stalin's era was complicated. While officially honored, Stalin suppressed many war heroes he hadn't personally elevated, and recognition fluctuated with political climate. Later, Soviet leadership celebrated the night witches more openly as exemplars of Soviet courage and women's contributions to victory. Popova received numerous additional honors throughout her life, including multiple anniversaries of her Hero of the Soviet Union award. She died in 2013 at age 91 in Moscow, one of the last surviving night witches, having lived to see her story finally reach audiences beyond Russia. For decades, the night witches remained virtually unknown in the West, their story lost in Cold War information restrictions and dismissed skepticism. During the Cold War, Western audiences had limited access to Soviet military history, and stories that emerged were often suspected as propaganda exaggeration. The 1980s glasnost period allowed more stories to emerge as Soviet archives opened partially. Through the 1990s and 2000s, historians gained access to previously classified documents and began documenting the night witches' operations with archival evidence. German testimonies from former prisoners of war validated Soviet accounts, confirming this wasn't propaganda, but documented history. Books, documentaries, and academic studies brought the story to Western audiences who were astonished to learn about women flying wooden biplanes in sustained combat operations. The Russian Air Force Museum in Monino features extensive night witches exhibits. Monuments and memorials honor the regiment in multiple Russian cities. Schools and streets bear names of prominent night witches. Films and documentaries continue exploring their story. Nadezhda Popova specifically received recognition as one of the most accomplished combat pilots in history. Her 852 missions documented in aviation records worldwide. The story of Nadezhda Popova and the night witches transcends its historical moment, offering lessons that extend beyond World War II's Eastern Front. About warfare, they proved asymmetric tactics can defeat technological superiority when applied with skill and determination. Psychological impact sometimes exceeds physical damage, as Germans learned when silent wooden biplanes disrupted operations more effectively than conventional bombing raids. Innovation matters more than resources, demonstrated by how 7-minute maintenance cycles enabled operational tempo that sophisticated aircraft couldn't match. Underestimating any enemy based on preconceptions creates fatal vulnerabilities that skilled adversaries will exploit ruthlessly. About prejudice and assumption, Germans' dismissive attitudes toward women and obsolete aircraft blinded them to genuine threats, until those threats had already inflicted massive damage. What appeared as enemy weakness, flying slow in wooden planes, became their greatest strength by operating below German engagement capabilities. About determination and resilience, flying 852 missions required extraordinary psychological fortitude because each mission carried the same fatal risks, regardless of how many times she'd survived before. The physical toll was immense, permanent damage to hearing and circulation, yet she continued climbing into that wooden cockpit night after night. About physics and engineering, sometimes simple design beats complex systems because constraints force innovation, while sophistication introduces failure points and maintenance requirements that limit effectiveness. The German officer who laughed at women in crop dusters that February morning in 1943 never understood what Nadezhda Popova and her sisters proved across 24,000 missions. That courage doesn't require the best equipment, that skill can overcome raw power, and that determination makes physics itself irrelevant. Her 852 missions weren't just combat sorties. They were proof that Germans had calculated thrust, speed, firepower, and cost ratios, while missing the one variable that mattered most: the will to fight for survival against an enemy who considered you subhuman and expendable. In wooden biplanes that shouldn't have worked, against adversaries who refused to take them seriously until it was too late, the Night Witches proved that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the most powerful one. It's the one your enemy never sees coming, flying silent below their minimum speed, dropping bombs from ghosts they dismissed as impossible.